So now that we have a fairly good looking button and input, we're going to start adding some more features, namely some validation. What we're going to do is ensure that the username is present and it has a minimum of at least 5 characters. And we'd like that minimum to be dynamic, so we're going to pass that as a prop. Let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is add a new property here. I'm going to pass one called rules, and this is going to be an object. We're going to have 2 values in here. We're going to have required, and this one's going to be true, so you need to have this input filled out to submit the form. And we're also going to have a minimum length, and I'm going to set that one to be 5 for now. Now the next thing we need to do is go and upgrade our input to make sure it does the correct checks here to validate the input. Let's head over to my input now, and we're going to upgrade this. The first thing we're going to need to do is declare the props we're going to receive. So I'm going to jump inside of here and create another one called rules. And this one's going to have a type of object. This is not very explanatory. It's very hard to know what properties are going to be on this object, but there's not really a better way of doing this other than using something like TypeScript, which adds a lot more complexity. So I'm going to keep this one very simple for now, but I'm going to add a comment here that says minimum and required. The next thing we're going to need to do is validate the input. So let's go ahead and first get our error rendering, and then we're going to make it a bit more dynamic. What I'd like to do is render my error on the right hand side of the input over here in red. So let's go ahead and do that first. I'm going to create a new div here, and we're going to give it a class of label. And inside of here, we're going to have our input, the label rather, and we're also going to have the error message if there's one present. So I'm going to create a new div here, give this one a class of error, and we're just going to render a static string for now to see if everything is working. Let's go ahead and give this some more styling. The next thing I'm going to do actually is add a class here, and we're going to call this one input wrapper, just because I really prefer not to style divs. I find it very confusing and it does lead to some little bugs. So what we're going to do is upgrade this one as well to be input wrapper. Now we're going to go ahead and style the label class which I just created. The first thing I'm going to do here is give it a display of flex, and that's going to make everything be side by side, and that's going to be fine. The next thing I'm going to do is give it a color of red to show that it is indeed an error. And now that we have that, we're going to also add justify content, and we're going to say space around, and that's going to ensure that the space is going to be space between rather actually. So justify content space between, and that's going to space everything out nicely. Let's go ahead and save this one off, and we can see the error is now on the right hand side of the form. But we have another problem now. We have both the username and error highlighted in red, which is not really correct. What instead I'm going to do is style the error class instead of the label class. So let's just jump down here to label, and instead of making this one red, we're going to move this outside, and we're going to put this one inside an error class instead. And if I save this one off now, only the error is red, which is definitely an improvement. So now that we have this, we need to have some more dynamic validation here. We need to figure out if the value in here is matching the rules, and if it's not, we're going to show the correct error message. So the first thing we're going to need to do is have some way to keep track of the current value in the input, which we haven't got right now. What we can do for now is just use vModel, and we're going to bind to a variable called value, which I'm going to create right now. So let's just jump down here and create a new data function. And as we have seen before, this needs to return an object. So I'm going to just say return in here. We're going to return value and just set it to be null or an empty string for now. Let's go ahead and save this one off, and everything is still working. So what we need to do now is have some way to compute whether there is an error or not. The error is basically derived from this value here. So we can go ahead and use a computed value. And if you remember from before, the way you can create a computed value is by creating a function with no arguments. In this case, it's going to be an error, and we're going to do our validation inside of here. And we have 2 different things to check. One is to see if the input has a string in it or not. If there's nothing there and it is required, we're going to show that it is required and show an error. And if there is an input value there, but it's too short, we're going to show that it does not meet the minimum length requirements. So the first thing I'm going to do is a check in here and see if this.rules.required is true. And if it is true, and then this.value.length is equal to 0, so that means there's going to be no string, we're going to go ahead and return the correct error here. So I'm just going to say return required. Let's go ahead and save this one off, and we're going to use our new computed property in our DOM template up here. Let's go ahead and do that. I'm just going to render error in here. And if we save this one off, we can see it's now showing required because the input hasn't got any string in it. If I type something in here, it is going to go away, and that's exactly what we expected. The next thing we need to do is validate if the input is there, but it's too short. So what I'm going to do is jump down here, and we're just going to check again. We're going to say if this.rules.minimum and this.value.length is less than this.rules.minimum, we know it's going to be too short and we need to show the correct error. So what I'm going to do is return another error here, and we're just going to use string interpolation and say minimum length is, and pass in the length. In this case, it's going to be this.value. This.rules.min actually is what we really want to pass in. Let's go ahead and try this out. I'm going to save this one off and head back. It's currently required. If I type some things in, it's showing the minimum length is 5. And if we keep on typing, the error is going to go away. And and that's working exactly as we expected. There is one small improvement we can make. Because this.value, which is an empty string, evaluates to be false value, I can actually delete this and just say this.value and add this operator here. And this is going to evaluate to true if the length is 0. It just makes it a little bit more concise and a bit more readable. So if we save this one off, we can just verify it's still working correctly, and so it is. The last thing we're going to do is add one more input to our form. So we're going to have both a username and a password. So let's go ahead and create a password as well. And this is going to be exactly the same, but we're going to have a different minimum length, and this one is going to have a minimum length of 10. Let's save it off and see if it's working. So it's required now, the minimum length is 10, and now it is working correctly. So we're definitely in a good place. We've created a very reusable component, and we've seen how easy it was to create two components here, both with their own customized validation and customized minimum length.